Gonna time myself. I think someone's worried I might go over time. Unfortunately, I don't want to be called Fidel. I missed my Havana trip earlier. So, thank you so much again. It's such a pleasure to be joining you guys. I mean, this is I think 4 years late.
Yeah.
We're hoping to have this back in around this time, but in 2020, right? And as the dateline approached, then maybe there's this virus. Or maybe we'll postpone it a little bit and then maybe never, right? So thank God the never happened, right? So this is happening, and to be honest, and I'm sure we can have more conversation about this. I think this is even a better time to be New Zealand. It's always a great time to be here, but I think for some of the folks who are familiar with my line of thinking, perhaps I see much more room for conversation now than before. Obviously, back then we had, I don't know if you remember the guy, what's his name? Rodrigo Duterte, right? Was the president of the Philippines. And so whenever I give talks around the world, half of the conversation is, my God, I have to explain this guy, right? It was extremely challenging, although I would admit that I welcome speaking engagements all the time because I was not sure I'm safe enough back home, back in the day. Now it's a very different picture. I'm getting invitation all around the world, so Europe, US, multiple trips, Japan, and others for a different reason, which is to explain why we have such a fantastic president, supposedly. And obviously, remember, Marcos says, not necessarily a bastion of good governance and progressive values. Nevertheless, there's this perception that the Philippines is finally moving in the right direction, right? Honestly, yeah. The Philippines finally moving. You never know, right? Been a long day. The film is moving in the right direction. Now, obviously, it goes without saying that anyone who's following things very closely would know that, unfortunately, sometimes our conceptions of different countries are based on snapshots, and snapshots sometimes can become extremely misleading, right? At the regional level, of course, I think. Maybe this is the DC blob or some of the other folks I deal a lot with. There's this conception that ASEAN is already, this is now the Chinese backyard, right? And too many people are in Team China, or ASEAN is divided between Team China and Team Philippines. And you can say, if you take a snapshot and statements of Anwar Ibrahim versus statements of Ferdinand Marcos, you may have those kind of conceptions, but that's very problematic when you actually scratch the surface, right? And I don't want to get in trouble, but I think with New Zealand also there's always some misconception. I remember last time I and David were together we were just flying to Pyongyang, right? And it was not it was a rough ride. And I just asked him, by the way, I just heard from my DC friends that you guys are the weak link in the Five Eyes and all of that, and immediately that sparked the whole conversation. And I noticed you're as just defensive about New Zealand as I was about the Philippines, to say that there are a lot of misconceptions. So in that sense, I feel a lot of common ground with you guys, in the sense that we are small-sized, medium-sized countries with strong cultural, linguistic, and security ties with the West, but at the same time, we want to preserve a certain degree of independence in terms of our action and room for maneuver, and we want to make sure that we come out of this not only alive but hopefully thriving in this kind of new cold era period. Now, let me quickly just give you a snapshot of the region. Of course, we'll discuss that tomorrow more when I will discuss the 50 shades of hedging we're seeing across the region, and then quickly talk about the Philippines, because as some of you may know, today is the Philippines National Independence Day, so it's quite a special day for a lot of us, and I think there are certain parts of the Philippines that people have almost forgotten and are completely unaware of, and I'll just kind of touch on that. But before that, let me first of all discuss the region. If you look at it, 4 or 5 years ago, if someone asked you about the situation in Vietnam and their direction of their foreign policy towards United States and China, it would be a completely different picture. And I think very few people foresaw the tremendous amount of political dynamism and instability and uncertainty we're seeing in a country like Vietnam. We can have a long conversation about that, and my understanding of Vietnam comes from more than a decade dealing with our friends in Hanoi, obviously because of the South China Sea issue, but of course, obviously also because of their coffee and fantastic pho. And as far as Malaysia is concerned, I remember very well when Mahathir was the Prime Minister. The first year was, wow, this is interesting, bashing China and all of that. The next year, once he got the discount on the BR projects, he was singing to a completely different tune, right? Anwar Ibrahim, we can have a long conversation about, he's a beacon of, progressive values. We love him very much in the Philippines. We just gave him an honorary doctorate in our Asian Center. He is a big aficionado of Philippine history, Rizalista and all of that. We can discuss that a little bit later on. Don't worry, within 2 minutes or so. So my problem is that when we look at countries across the region, you can take snapshots and that can give you very misleading points of view. With Indonesia, for instance, Jokowi, his first term, he was seen as a kind of a mayor president who didn't even pay attention to international affairs. I mean, he had a trip to Washington, D.C., but we saw suddenly in his last 2-3 years, he stepped up to the plate, G20 leadership. And then with Prabowo, you would hear completely contradictory points of view, but my understanding is with Prabowo is he's a very complex character, as one top journalist put it to me. So it really depends how we deal with them. And this is where I go to the case of the Philippines. Obviously, if you look at the Duterte administration, there's a statement by the president, and statements, optics matter in politics and geopolitics. Because most of the time, people, even journalists, only have time for your TikTok version or Reels version, right? Well, for some of us who have chance for a podcast long-form version, perhaps we have a much more sophisticated understanding of these leaders. I mean, I've had the chance to talk to multiple heads of state, and I was just amazed how behind the scenes everyone was actually smarter than I thought, right? Much more nuanced, right? Wow. So what happened, right? And then you understand, of course, in our era, it's a TikTok Reels version that unfortunately runs the show. So even during the Duterte administration, if you talk to many of the senior officials, people in the government, they had a far more nuanced view. I mean, they would say, yeah, the president says horrible things about the West and our history, but you have to understand where it comes from, the sense that we were taken for granted by the Americans, by the way, which is true. And they even cited my own articles against me. You were saying this stuff, Duterte is saying this time a little bit spicier, right? So there was always this kind of a duality or contestation as far as the Philippine foreign policy was concerned, even during the time of Duterte. And in fact, some scholars would argue, and I'm somehow sympathetic to this when I think about it, that there was also a degree of performativity to the Philippines, hedging or playing the both powers. Because Duterte would say all of things like, I love China, China will protect me, make us a province of China, half jokingly supposedly. And then at the same time, our alliance with the United States was more or less intact, right? This is important because this will help me to, in the next 4 minutes, explain what's happening with Marcos. There is this optics and perception that, Duterte, Marcos, not necessarily bastions of good governance, but Duterte is the bad guy, pro-China guy, Marcos is the good guy, the Wunderkid, right? Putting the Philippines on the right map. But actually, if you analyze it, by 2021 already, the Philippines was making the pivot. In 2021, Lloyd Austin was in Manila. Duterte thanked the Americans for giving us millions of Moderna vaccine. The Chinese one was delayed and very expensive, by the way. And we restored fully the visiting forces agreement, which was somehow hanging in the balance. And then by October that year, during the ASEAN-China summit, President Duterte openly came out and criticized China and used the word, I abhor what's happening back then during the Whitsun Reef incident in the South China Sea. So that shift was already happening there, but very gradual and below the radar. So if you were just listening to Duterte's rants, or you remember his spiciest comments, this would completely escape your attention. So when Marcos came in, he was already building on that recalibration or course correction that was happening in Philippine foreign policy, because honestly, we didn't get debt trap, we got pledge trap, empty pledges in exchange for geopolitical concessions. Now, Marcos is being Marcoses, politicians. First, he tried to sound like the old Duterte, like let's be nice to China and all, but as soon as it was clear to him that he was not going to get anything from China, and as soon as it was clear to him that the Democrats in the White House apparently were going to roll out the red carpet to him, he felt he's in a position to more actively play the hedging strategy. So what is the Philippines doing right now is by building our security partnerships with like-minded countries around the world, he wants to have that kind of leverage so that he can deal with China. Because Marcos Jr. is someone whose pictures you can find online with Mao Zedong when he was barely in 20s. This is a guy who instinctively understands. He may not have the academic credentials. I mean, he had attended Oxford and then graduated ever, but he has an instinctive psychological understanding of nuances of geopolitics in ways no Filipino president has had. Probably none of us in this room has ever had. And he realized China will not respect you unless you have something, right? That bargaining chip. And in many ways, redoubling of our security cooperation with the Americans, building of this squad, right? This new quad, building of JAFUS, Japan-Philippine Security Alliance, reaching out to you guys here in New Zealand, and like-minded powers in Europe. The French are pushing for a reciprocal access agreement, sales of submarines to us. This is all a defensive move on the part of the Philippines to have a degree of bargaining chip. And to be clear, Marcos has consistently said, we're not here to provoke. And during his Shangri-La Dialogue keynote speech, he also made it clear we don't want to choose between the two superpowers, because both of them are vital when it comes to prosperity and stability in that part of the world. So my contention is the Philippines is still hedging also its bets, even if it's a US treaty ally, and even if it's having these very difficult tensions with China. And as far as, I have 2 minutes or so, as far as tensions with China are concerned, my contention is that China is treating the Philippines extra badly, just short of provoking war, precisely because it's worried that the Philippines may fully align with the US, and a full alignment with the US would essentially mean us giving the Americans maximal access to bases in the north of the country that face Taiwan. So one thing that makes Philippines unique among all ASEAN countries, among many other things of course, is that we are at the front line of two major flashpoints. Both South China Sea, where we're the only ASEAN country nowadays, not even the Vietnamese anymore, openly calling out China to our transparency initiative, but we're the only ASEAN country. I mean, honestly, Manila is closer to Taipei than any major ASEAN capital. We're the only country who would be in ASEAN that would be central to American strategy of deterring a Chinese invasion in Taiwan. And that is where China is really worried. I think a lot of this is to intimidate the Philippines so that we do not fully align with America. And my contention is this is where the Philippines has another bargaining chip. Many would disagree with me in the Philippines, including former admirals and experts among others. But my contention is I don't think a war is likely in the foreseeable future for a million reasons we can have a long conversation about. I'm almost 12 minutes. But I think this gives a leverage to the Philippines to get concessions in the South China Sea, because we could easily say, if you do not give us what we need in the South China Sea, stop the bullying, stop flirting with war, we're going to give the Americans everything they need vis-a-vis Taiwan. Then you're going to be in big trouble. So this is a bargaining chip for the Philippines. In the meantime, while we're figuring out our strategy on this issue, the challenge is we also don't know how to deal with China's gray zone strategy. So what we're doing right now, and we saw that during the question and answer, I don't know if I can call them Chinese military officials, more like the troll army they had during the Shangri-La Dialogue, we made it very clear. The parameters of our security cooperation with America should not be modality-based, meaning you do not activate mutual defense treaty only strictly when the Chinese are using guns and live fire. Even if they're using water cannons, if it kills a Filipino serviceman or creates some serious fatal damage to any of our public vessels and personnel, that should activate the mutual defense treaty. And last one, we cannot also be too specific about this, and there should be vagueness, because maybe our Chinese friends would say, oh, so we can still do all of this A to Z. So you can, now we add a new thing. So we have to be also very smart about that. That's why there is still a degree of embedded ambiguity as far as both Marcos' statements and America's statement is concerned. But just as we speak, we're having very difficult, very high stakes operational discussions, because if God forbid something serious happens during the South China Sea, the implications would be immense. And at that point, hedging is no longer an option almost for anyone in the region, because all of us will have to make our choices. So not making a choice is a choice itself, but it will be a luxury and increasingly an impossibility if we do not address these disputes. Thank you very much. 1 minute above time, but I think we're going more conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard, and a very succinct, to the minute tour de force of Philippines foreign policy and how you're seeing geopolitics in the region. Thank you. I mean, I have many questions, but I also have the honor of dinner with you tonight, so I will open it up to the floor, I think, to see if anyone has any opening questions for Richard at this point. Please go ahead.
How would it play with the Filipino public if the government is to say to the U.S. that, okay, you can come in, you can use Clark and Subic again as you would like?
Well, constitutionally, Americans or anyone is barred from building permanent bases. But how many American troops will be allowed in those EDCA bases? How many HIMARS weapon systems will be allowed? Those things are still up for grabs. Not to mention there are a number of other vital facilities that we have not opened yet to the Americans under EDCA. So there's still huge room for maneuver and a whole spectrum of options operationally and strategically. Yeah.
But how would the Filipino public respond to that?
Well, I think if, God forbid, something crazy happens in the South China Sea, some very serious injury or anything like that, that would definitely change the conversation. Then we may even talk about constitutional changes to maybe even further the concept of permanent bases from abroad. But let me be very clear, I think there's also a growing sentiment in the Philippines among the strategic elite that, you know, this is not 1970s and 80s. We don't want to be just another American overseas base. As I put it, I think the challenge for the Philippines is to make sure and signal to the world that we don't want to be just the, just the Pearl Harbor of the West against China, or the tip of the dagger pointing at them. Because this is the Philippines, which is $500 billion economy. It's going to be $1 trillion economy soon. It has one of the biggest populations in Asia and soon top 10 in the world. So we're talking about now, not a satellite state of America, but more a legitimate rising middle power, which can have its own strategic agency and autonomy. I mean, it's interesting, you hear the word strategic agency in Marcos' statements. I've never heard many heads of state mentioning those terms. Those are like geeky, wonky stuff we use in our circles. But President Marcos, because he's also conscious not to come off as America's boy, right? And you know, in the Philippines, there are all sorts of conspiracy theories, especially with pro-China people, that, oh, maybe Americans bought off Marcos, you know, and as if, how exactly? And for my pro-China friends, I say it's quite rich for you guys to talk about bribery and corruption, right? Because we can have a long conversation about your very interesting surreptitious sets of agreements with Duterte, and who knows, you know, nests of espionage and all sorts of mumbo jumbo that happened during his term. So one of the reasons I welcome this conversation and the reason I go across the world is to remind people ASEAN of today is not the ASEAN of the 1960s and 70s. These are far richer, far more capable, and more self-confident country. And as I said a few weeks ago in Stanford, what you're going to see in ASEAN soon, especially in the larger countries, is what you're already seeing in India nowadays. So if you look at it on surface, India is a country with barely $3,000 per capita income. So you say, yeah, you're still a poor developing country. But look at how Jai Shankar and their diplomats handled themselves. Look at the appeal of modismo, although I think Rahul Gandhi did a pretty good job of clipping the wings here and there. I think you're going to see baby versions of that. Prabowo is already signaling a version of that the Indonesia that is coming is a G20 Indonesia that feels very confident. You're going to see versions of that in the Philippines. I think Duterte was kind of the caricature version of a more sophisticated, right, and self-confident Philippines that we haven't since I don't know, end of Second World War, since the time of Carlos Piro, among other things. So it's going to be a very different world. And of course, most importantly, this is not a world where America calls the shot. America is just one of the great powers. And while I could give US like strategic autonomy of, I don't know, 10 out of 10, other countries went from 0 to 4 or 5. So that completely changes the complexion and the quality of interaction we're seeing there. So I think in the Philippines, there's definitely a lot of anti-China sentiment. Just around 90% of people have negative conceptions of China and a lot of positive statements about US. But I think there's also a lot of push for the Philippines to scale up. Not to mention, there's still residual resentment, at least among the strategic elite, about what we felt was lack of commitment by the Obama, essentially from Kissinger to Obama. Supposed strategic ambiguity on the South China Sea was more ambiguity than strategy, because it just gave China the carte blanche to push the envelope. And thanks to the, not a fan, but from Trump to Biden administration, we saw the clarity in the geographic and operational parameters. But I said, even that needs an update because our Chinese friends are very innovative with how they deploy their gray zone strategies. So we're living through a very interesting transition era, right? And things that we were talking about in 10, 15 years ago in very academic, wonky, weirdy circle are now like in the statements of the president and national security advisor and all. So I feel vindicated, I feel happy about it. It shows strategic maturity in terms of strategic culture. So, yeah.
Oh, yes.
Maybe more a domestic power and who has power and how that's projected. You know, interested in your view how capable the Philippine state is, and whether, you know, the Sabine Aboites and the PSACs and the Jazzer Ayala Zabels and those guys really have, so is capability and power projection and economic development kind of led by these conglomerate families or actually the state itself?
Yeah, maybe I'll go off there, but no, I'm just kidding. No, go ahead. Oligarchs, right? We were discussing the oligarchs. Yeah, I mean, oligarchs are a reality in the Philippines, but interestingly, even with the oligarchs, we have a 50 Shades situation. So there are some old rich families which have realized, A, we cannot just be extractive and juicing out this 100 million market. Why not let's be more globalized, modernized, and then we can become a global company. And there are a lot of Filipino big companies and conglomerates who have Spanish connections. Some of them, very strongly Spanish blooded, and they're trying to be. So if you go to Spain nowadays, a lot of big investors are Filipino. And then they also want to expand into Latin America and be operating a lot of emerging markets. So you're seeing even the modernization of the Philippine oligarchy, which for a long time explains the weak state situation we have had and this tremendously inward-looking strategic culture. So, and not to mention their new generation of leaders also emerging, like the Ayalas, for instance, have a very young guy already in charge, who I think are much more forward-looking and much more progressive in terms of their outlook. So, the lefty in me is obviously angry at any kind of form of oligarchy or concentration of power, but at the same time, I cannot also, have a blanket categorization because you're seeing that kind of dynamism. Not to mention, we have 30, 35 million Filipino middle class who go all around the world and see the best practices from Scandinavia, New Zealand, and they want better services. Why is our internet so crappy? Why is it so expensive? Which it is, by the way. So they want more. There's more pressure from the consumer class, from the middle class, for them to behave. On Twitter, we bully big companies. You can get away. It works. It works. So again, that dynamic is also changing. Now, speaking of Marcos, I don't know how well he did in his industrial strategy class, if ever he really took PPE or economics, but I think there's also an appreciation that the Philippines needs an industrial strategy. And as any expert would tell you, we cannot do it like the 20th century. Definitely not like Latinos, but I'm saying even the Korean style or the Taiwanese and Japanese style is not doable. So as Daniel Roderick and a lot of experts would say, if you wanted the industrial strategy, it has to be sector specific, it has to be collaborative, right? And it has to have, you cannot be over ambitious about it, right? So for instance, semiconductors is one area we're looking at whereby I call it Taiwan +1 strategy. Taiwan is so close to the Philippines, right? And the kind of importance the Philippines is gonna have for Taiwan's fate as a self-ruling nation, that could be leveraged for high quality movement of certain parts of the supply chain. Obviously the high-end fabrication, that's TSMC, Japan, whatever, but product design, packaging, some of the more intermediate level semiconductor production. I come from Baguio City, an American built city where Texas Instrument is there forever. So I could see with my own eyes throughout my childhood and now that we have some capacity to be involved in something more interesting than just exporting bananas. I have nothing against bananas. We have great bananas and mangoes, right? You guys have great export stuff. But so moving up the value added, it's very doable. Now, the oligarchy part is interesting because electricity rates are crazy in the Philippines, but so during the trilateral summit in White House between, among Kishida, Marcos, and Biden, one of the things they look at is corridors of development. So what could happen is that some of these oligarchs, you mentioned some of them, they could give special rates with some high quality infrastructure in certain areas, kind of like special economic zone, but these are like special high quality strategic investment zones, right? Because the reality is, do you really think Vietnams and Malaysias of this world, or even Thailands, are really reliable when it comes to the question of Taiwan, among others? And yes, you can say Vietnam definitely has slightly more attraction than the Philippines, and maybe Thailand, Malaysia more. But my idea there is, in sports, there's something called scouting, right? So a great talent scout doesn't go for the obvious ace, because everyone will go. A good talent scout goes for that a bit rough diamond that if you tweak it a little bit could be your next Ronaldo or Messi. And I think Philippines is that rough diamond. Tremendous amount of potential. Not the ace player yet, a little bit overshadowed by your usual suspects. But this is a country that if you invest in has tremendous amount of strategic dividends and return on investments down the road. So it has to be a two-way street. Obviously, it goes without saying, domestically, we're also trying to put more pressure on our government. And yes, even oligarchs step up to the game, right? Because we are in a sweet spot, but if we don't take advantage of this, then we're going to lose another window. We lost that window in the 80s and 90s when a lot of our Southeast Asian countries, friends were moving into becoming their own Silicon Valley, like the Malaysians and Thai. But I think we have another interesting opportunity whereby our geopolitical asset could be leveraged for getting in more investments like never before. So these are also the kind of conversation we're having today that we didn't have 5 to 10 years ago, right? So this, for me, again, is a way for the Philippines to enhance its strategic autonomy. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about your perspective? You mentioned at the top about the Philippine-New Zealand relationship. You've seen Prime Minister Luxon go, the foreign minister is just coming back. Just kind of where does that relationship go as smaller countries march into the second part of the 21st century? Where do you see that growing?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I say, you know, Kiwis, you have such tremendous soft power in the Philippines. Every professional, everyone I know that wants to get another passport or something, they think about New Zealand, right? Of course, the pretentiously posh ones like me want to go back to España, right? They say we want Europe and all of that. Yeah, the typical ones want to go to the US, but you know, US, have a long conversation. So New Zealand right now is like the hot spot. Like I said, everyone who gets to know, oh no, where are your latest? I said, oh yeah, I'm in New Zealand doing my travel vlogs, right? Oh, fantastic, you have to taste this, you have to taste that. So there's tremendous, I mean, I think there's over-romanticization obviously of New Zealand. And I got to, you know, get a wake-up call about your interesting, you know, realities and all, and the QAnon and all. But the thing is, there is a conception like New Zealand is a nearby Scandinavia, right? In terms of egalitarianism, in terms of upward mobility. I was just in Christchurch and they were telling me the Filipino community there has the highest home ownership among the immigrant minority group, which tells you like, wow, it's such an inspiring story. So if you come in, you're coming. And then the important thing is, you know, unlike Aussies, you don't have this, I mean, there's no perception of you being the deputy sheriff of America in this part of the world. I'm not saying Aussies are, I love them, but I'm saying you come with that bag. In fact, I'll tell you what, probably it's misconception. The misconception of New Zealand among the people who know anything or two is like, you guys are the woke guys, right? You're woke and you're, you know, you're Nordic and probably Helen Clark is the most known one and Jacinda Ardern. So I think the other challenge is also to communicate this, that, you know, New Zealand has a diverse spectrum of opinion, etc. But I think there's a lot of potential there. In fact, there's now a very long line of many like-minded countries coming up, trying to look at reciprocal access agreements with the Philippines. The French, the Japanese are about to finish it, and the new guys. So there's a lot we can do. Now, I think the value of New Zealand to us is that, you know, whenever there's some major incident in the South China Sea, the usual suspects speak out. I welcome, I mean, which is America, Japanese, Australians. But I think it always matters more when the so-called non-aligned countries like India, like, yes, South Korea is supposed to be U.S. treaty ally, but they always try to say we're not involved in South China Sea because, you know, we have North Korea, of course, that's always their excuse, while they're selling us warships and everything. And then for me, New Zealand also, because you're a non-aligned country or you don't have a defense treaty with the US, it gives more credibility to that. Because my worry actually is, you know, like when I see my Filipino friends clapping, look at it, the American support, I said, yeah, but it actually feeds into the Chinese narrative that you're just one of the Western guys. And now I was, you know, for some reason they're not inviting many Filipino nowadays, but at the Asia Pacific Roundtable recently, apparently on the sides, I know people were talking about what I've been talking about for a long time, which is this idea of ASEAN minus Philippines. Philippines as America's deputy sheriff in ASEAN. So there's that kind of ostracization of the Philippines. That's why Marcos, in fairness to him, keeps on harking back to ASEAN centrality and keeps on saying, no, we're not here to choose. You know, he's extending the olive branch because, you know, but there's that game whereby they're trying to portray us as the outsiders in ASEAN. You're the weirdos, you're the outliers, you're the American satellite or whatever. So it's important for us when more and more non-aligned countries, and New Zealand I think has a very decent track record, credible track record to say non-aligned, speak out. So that's the also added value that you guys bring in. And then if you look at just the full range of challenges we're going to face, you know, vulnerability in our basic infrastructure, the need for us, I mean, the Philippines archipelagic coastline is just as big as Russia's, right? I mean, if you look at the coastlines of Russia, and then it's almost the same. So top 5, top 6 in the world. But our capabilities are nowhere close to where it should be. So we have so much need in terms of ISR and other kind of basic domain. I mean, one area that we're almost blind. So in fairness, we went from 0 to 5, let's say, in terms of South China Sea, thanks to help by the Coast Watch, our friend, to Japan. But we're almost blind when it comes to what's happening in the Philippine Sea, right? Which is extremely resource rich. This is the second island chain. We're also quite blind to submarine movements in the Bashi Channel and the Luzon Strait. So you can imagine there's so much need for any kind of support or technical support or technological support we can get from other side. And then of course, I think both of our nations, we didn't get enough credit, but I think both of us have a lot of unsung startup companies who could be integrated into the defense industry, a whole of nation approach. So the potential is just really immense. And I think all we need is, you invite more people like me here, and then, we can, what we need is more of the dialogue, right? And conversation and all. And I think it's naturally easier for Kiwis and Filipinos to relate because we're kind of the plucky underdogs sometimes, right? Which is harder to say when you're dealing with much more powerful and much more aligned powers in the region, vis-a-vis the United States and all of that. Yeah. Was it good enough?
That was great.
That was good.
I'm acutely aware that we are standing in the way of people having more drinks and getting to talk
Oh,
to
should I feel
Rich.
bad? Yeah.
No, you shouldn't feel bad. Well, you'll be ahead of lunch tomorrow, so that's even worse. If you want to hear more from Richard, he will be at the Maritime Security Symposium tomorrow, and also here for the next half an hour or so to continue the discussion. But thank you so much, Richard.
Thank you very much. Very kind of you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.